Hello to all and welcome back to the long-awaited Should You Get. Yes, it's been a while since I did my last Should You Get. I haven't really been feeling them, but fortunately I am back, and in the name of Christmas, I thought I would give a present to you all. A present of a tank that I absolutely love in every way, and is by far one of, if not the, most overpowered tank in the game. Now, I've already made a video on this tank, and it was a compilation of how, well, 99%, actually no, not 99%, actually 100% of how all of my matches in it ended. But don't let this fool you, because this tank is extremely good. So as per usual, if you would like to skip ahead to the review on the tank in War Thunder, then go to this time on your screens now. Otherwise, let's get straight in to the history of this tank and see what made it what it was. So then, the self-propelled 17-pounder Valentine Mark I Archer was a tank that was produced from March 1943 to May 1945. Now they saw service in the UK military from September 1944 and onwards to a unknown date, surprisingly enough, but it is probably fair to say that they probably did see combat with the British military into the 50s. Now, the United Kingdom and Egypt were the only two countries to have used this tank, and it was a tank that saw combat in both World War II and the Suez Crisis. Now, some of you may be wondering why it has the word Valentine in its name, and it's actually because that the chassis of the tank itself comes from the outdated Valentine, well, British tanks. The reason because of this was simply because that the British had an awful lot of these chassis that we didn't need, and we wanted a tank that was light and wouldn't require a particularly powerful or large chassis, which was, well, sought to be perfect for the use of the Valentine fuselages and chassis, of which there were many of them. It is also true to say that the Crusader chassis were also looked into, however, in the end, the Valentine chassis was of course chosen. The interesting thing about choosing between the Valentine and Crusader chassis was that both of these had advantages in their own way. You see, the Valentine was a lot lower for a chassis, meaning that the tank could be shorter and offer more of a sort of stealthy role, good for ambushing and being undetected by enemies. Or they could choose the Crusaders, which had a better power to weight ratio, meaning that it could get in and out of a battle a lot faster and would allow it to offer things such as outflanking the opponents, or at least doing it better than if it was to have the Valentine, which meant that it could be more of a fast response roles, and could mean that it could be used alongside things like the British cavalry tank divisions and things like that. But, as I've already mentioned, the Valentine was chosen in the end, and this is quite unsurprising when you realise its main role and what it was intended to be used for on the battlefield. Now, the most notable part of the Valentine Archer is its rear-facing cannon, and in fact it's the only tank I've ever known that has a only rear-facing cannon, as of course it has no turret. It can only fire backwards, with the allowance of 11 degrees both sides for traversing, and elevation from minus 7.5 degrees to plus 15 degrees, which actually meant that it was a pretty good vehicle, all things considered, and its traversing from sideways and elevation was better than most tanks of its time with a fixed turret. But the real question is, why was it looking backwards the whole time? And it was mainly one of two reasons that was the reason why Vickers Armstrong chose for it to be looking backwards. And this reason, firstly, is that it makes the tank shorter. Because you see, when it comes to a regular tank with their barrel sticking out the front, that's quite long, isn't it? It's quite a long way outside of the vehicle, and you can see that if this tank was facing forwards with that turret, the turret would be almost the same size as the chassis, for God's sake. It would stick out and make it nearly twice as long. However, with it looking backwards, you can see about 3/4 of the actual cannon itself is the same length on the chassis, meaning that it only actually sticks out another foot or two. And the second and most notable feature of this tank, and why the cannon was facing backwards, was for its most notable role, that being ambushing. Now, this tank was an excellent ambusher, and was quite well known for it. And in fact, the reason why it's facing backwards with its cannon, and why that would be useful in an ambush, is because when you are in an ambushing situation, you want to be able to fire a large powerful shell, like its 17-pounder, and then get away, especially if you're in a lightly armoured tank like the Archer. And by facing backwards all the time, you are allowing yourself to immediately drive away, and with its light chassis and light design in general, it can drive away pretty fast, or at least in comparison to other tanks. Also, before anyone tries to say, but can't you just get a tank that aims, like, you just turn the tank 180 degrees so its back is facing the enemy, then just make it fire at them and then drive away, like, you know, what's the point in it only looking backwards? But there is actually a good reason for this. First of all, by allowing it to not have a turret, it is shorter. If this had a turret ring, which meant the entire turret would have to turn, it would have to be taller anyway. Not by much, but it would have to be taller. And it means that, often it didn't need to be able to have a turret ring, because that it could aim down. And that is something not a lot of tanks could do. Not a lot of tanks could turn the turret around 180 degrees, and then some of them couldn't even aim horizontally, let alone down. So with the Archer's ability of aiming minus 7.5 degrees downwards, backwards, that is something that very, very few tanks had at this time, and was a great feature of it. Now, interestingly enough, the Archer was never classified as a tank destroyer. In fact, the British and, fellow Commonwealth countries never called it a tank destroyer, and only classified it as a self-propelled anti-tank gun, which is quite unusual considering its design, but does make sense. You see, this tank was basically a glorified artillery piece. That's all it was. It may look like a tank, and it may have some tank characteristics, but it's basically just a very well armoured and easy to move artillery gun. And in fact, it was so much of an artillery gun over a tank that it was only ever used with the British Royal Artillery Regiments rather than the Royal Armoured Divisions, which, of the armoured divisions, they were using tanks such as the M10s and the 17-pounder Achilles. And when you think about it, that does make sense, because those tanks could take hits and could advance forward with their tanks firing forward. They were good on the offensive, and they were good at taking hits from other tanks and dishing out damage. The Archer could dish a lot of damage, but it didn't have the armour to resist enemy fire, and is basically, as already mentioned, just a glorified artillery gun. So, with all that in mind, let's think of it in War Thunder, and think if it does work quite well to its historical reputation. Now, the first thing you'll probably notice about this gun is that It is a tank that was designed in 1943 and was in service in 1944, and yet in War Thunder it's a Tier 2 3.3 battle rating tank. I mean, this tank is as new as British Centurions and German Tiger IIs. You know, it's a very late war design. And yet, despite this, it's in a 3.3 battle rating, absolutely nowhere near any equivalent tanks that were made of the time. So why is this? And, well, there is a very good reasons for why this is the case, but I'm not going to go over them just yet. And instead I am going to concentrate on the first good thing of the Archer, which is its 17-pounder gun. Now, at a 3.3 battle rating, there is not a single tank you will come up against that you cannot penetrate head-on from at about any distance. The gun is very, very powerful and has a very good penetration, especially for its battle rating. I mean, it does have a horrible, buggy habit that I've got a lot now, of hitting enemy tanks and getting a non-penetration on them, despite the fact I've hit a part of them that may has, like, I don't know, 100mm of defense, including things like the degrees of the armor backwards and that, and yet it still doesn't penetrate, which is a very, very strange thing that keeps happening as a really annoying bug, but, you know, what you're gonna do. On paper, this can penetrate anything from just about any range, which is pretty good. And that concludes everything that's good about it, even at its current battle rating. Yeah, I know, it's pretty tragic, to be perfectly honest with you, but regardless, let's go on to the disadvantages of this tank, and oh boy, where do I begin? I mean, the first thing I just want to say is that this tank in real life was a good tank. In fact, it was a great tank, even though this tank was 1944 and onwards. It was still seen as a great tank. And yet, despite this fact, in War Thunder, even though it's fighting tanks, some of its tanks it's fighting are in, 1940, 1939. Some of the tanks this thing fights are pre-Second World War designs, and yet it still loses against them. And this isn't because it's a bad tank, it's because the meta of War Thunder completely cripples this tank. Ambushing in War Thunder is a rarity at best. You won't ambush people in War Thunder, you just don't. And in War Thunder, having the use for an artillery gun, once again, is completely useless, because in War Thunder, the maps are tiny. Even some of the biggest maps in War Thunder are fairly small in comparison to real-life battlefields. I mean, some battlefields in the world have been as far as, many dozens and dozens of miles long, and yet you're looking at this tank, and the maps on War Thunder, and suddenly it makes sense that this thing isn't really designed for fighting in the War Thunder meta. So, yes, it's a great tank in real life, and War Thunder just cripples it because of its meta. So, with all that out the way, let's look at the actual stats of it that make it useless. First of all, it has absolutely no armor, and I'm talking no armor. Even though it says, for instance, on the Wikipedia, just for an example, it says that it had as high as 60mm of armor in some points, which is odd, because I can't see any part on the tank in War Thunder which has 60mm of armor, but then again it wouldn't really make much of a difference at its battle rank anyway, so I guess we can leave that be. And the second problem with the tank in War Thunder is that it has a frickin' rear-firing cannon! I mean, it's useless! In War Thunder, that is. Real life, once again, it was great. But in War Thunder, it's useless. And the reason is because the maps are too small. Once again, as already mentioned, this thing is not made for close quarters combat, and yet most War Thunder maps are close quarters combat. You would never see an archer fighting in a city in real life, and even if you did, it would be extremely rare. These were artillery pieces. They were They were miles away from the battlefield at some points, firing into the battlefield. They're not made for close quarters, and their armour speaks the whole story. And by having a cannon that only fires backwards, it means that if you're driving forward to try to get to an enemy position, if they spot you and shoot you, you have no armor cell penetrate immediately, and your cannon's facing backwards, so you have to try and turn around slowly to try and get into a position to shoot them, and by that point you'll be dead. And, better still, although you may be saying, oh well hang on, in real life these things are really good at driving away from danger. That was the point why they were facing in reverse, right? So they're good at that, aren't they? Right, at least they're good at that. And the answer is no. For once again, the very same reason. In War Thunder, it's nowhere near as difficult to spot enemy tanks as it is in real life. Not only this, but in War Thunder you can also spot people with little markers on the map, and when shells are coming in, you're not confined in a tiny little tank with only tiny little slits to see out of or anything, or you're not actually in the actual stresses of battle, so you can just casually look around, see where the shot's coming from, and then attack the target. Which of course isn't realistic. In real life, if you were getting hit by an enemy tank, you'd run away, because... or, you know, you'd get out, you'd run away, you wouldn't be looking for them, you'd be trying to not die. And, in War Thunder, as soon as you're spotted, they will just shoot you immediately and kill you, because you have no armor, and the reason why you can't run away is, as already mentioned, because they'll spot you fucking a mile away, and while you're trying to get away, they'll just shoot your engine, because it's literally in front of the tank. So then you can't do anything, and you're completely crippled. So yeah, great tank in War Thunder, it's pretty good. And another thing that ruins this tank in the meta of War Thunder is something that ruins all British tanks in the meta of War Thunder, which is having absolutely no high explosive armor piercing shells. And yes, I have already said this on another video, but I felt I'd at least mention it here again, because it really does suck. And that is that, well, if you can penetrate an enemy tank all you like, but unless you kill both the driver and the gunner in the same shot, 9 times out of 10 you won't get the kill. And the reason is simple. If you kill the gunner but not the driver, since this thing is so immobile and takes forever to drive after people because its reverse gear is very slow, and turning around to get to the enemy, then driving up to them, then turning around again will get you killed every time. So if you don't kill the driver, the enemies will just drive away, and then you can't really do anything about it. Or alternatively, if you kill the driver but not the gunner, then the gunner will just immediately turn around and one-shot you because they have high explosive armor piercing normally, and you don't. Which once again massively sucks and makes this tank even more shit than usual. I mean, in real life, once again, if a shell enters a tank, you would get out of that tank. You wouldn't stick around in that tank. If it was a massive shell, like a 17-pounder, then you definitely get out of that tank. You would not stay in that tank, right? Very, very few would ever do that. But in War Thunder, since you have unlimited morale, you won't get out of the tank. They'll just turn and shoot you. You'll die. It's horrible to drive in every way. In fact, it's so bad that, as you can see, I've just fully accepted the fate of driving this tank. What I've done is I've reused the French roundel as an actual target practice on the front of the tank, and I've put Du Doch Nicht all over it, over the 3 sides you can't fire from, which, for those who don't speak German, means definitely not you. And that's because that if you're seeing this thing from any other angle than where it's firing its gun from, you're definitely not going to die from it. And even if you are seeing this thing from where the gun is, I just put a... well, I decided to make it a little bit more sporting and make it a bit of a competition to see that when I inevitably die, I might as well see how accurate the people who are shooting me are, because let's face it, this thing isn't good for anything else. And I guess that means that we now have to say what would make this tank better. How to improve this tank and there isn't much to say. You could put down its battle rating, but it wouldn't make a difference. It has so little armor, any tank will happily penetrate this from any battle rating, and in fact, most of the videos I got when playing this tank, I was in like 5.0 battle rating games, and I was having absolutely no difference in gameplay, because this thing will penetrate just about everything even then, and everything will penetrate you even then, so it doesn't make a difference. So battle ratings are irrelevant for this tank. And, you know, the only other thing you could really add to this tank is allowing it to reload faster, which although wouldn't make it a very good tank, it would make it a lot less painful to use. So maybe just cut down its reload by a couple of seconds at least, and it may even become remotely bearable. Probably not, but, you know, anything helps. Which concludes the video with the question of, should you get the Valentine Mark I Archer? If you happen to go back in time about 70 years and you want to get one to fight a Second World War in, then I would recommend it. These were good tanks. But as you're currently playing War Thunder, no. And with that, I say thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.